The wheels of the stagecoach screamed against the rocky earth, a rhythmic punishing sound, thump, crack, groan. Clara gripped the leather strap inside the cabin. Her knuckles were bone white, her breathing was shallow. With every mile that pushed her further, the shadow at her back grew heavier. She looked down at her hands, soft hands, city hands, hands that had done terrible things to survive. Now they were supposed to be the hands of a devoted wife. They thought she was just a mail-order bride, a desperate spinster from Chicago, looking for a fresh start in the unforgiving embrace of the Nevada territory. They were wrong. She was a woman running out of time, and the men hunting her were not the kind to forgive or forget. The stagecoach lurched to a violent halt. Dust billowed through the open window, coating her throat in dry, bitter chalk. The driver yelled. Horses whinnied, their heavy hooves stomping the dry dirt. Blackwood Station. This was it. The end of the line. The beginning of the lie. Before she steps down into the brutal sun, before her boots touch the frontier, Dirt take a steady breath with her. Tell me what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this tale has traveled. Settle in. The West is a beautiful, dangerous place. Elias Thorne waited by the hitching post. He was a man carved from the very landscape, tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by brutal winters and scorching summers. His eyes were the color of slate, scanning the stagecoach with quiet, calculating intensity. He didn't want a wife for love. The West didn't leave room for romance. He needed a partner. The Silver Creek Ranch was failing. The bank was circling like vultures. The cattle were thin. He needed someone to hold the center while he fought the wolves at the door. He expected a sturdy woman, a plain woman with practical shoes and a strong back. Then the coach door opened. Clara stepped out. The harsh midday sun hit her face, illuminating the sharp, elegant curve of her jaw. Her eyes, a striking, desperate shade of green, met his. Elias felt a strange tightening in his chest, a sudden lack of air. She was too beautiful, too delicate, and too terrified. He stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel, a slow, deliberate sound. "Miss Clara," he said. His voice was a deep rumble, like thunder rolling over the distant mountains. "Mr. Thorne?" Her voice was soft, but it didn't tremble. She wouldn't let it. She had practiced this moment 100 times in the dark rocking of the coach. He took her trunk. It was heavy, too heavy for a simple bride with nothing to her name. He didn't ask. He just swung it into the back of his wagon. "It's a long ride to the property," he said, not looking at her. "Sun's hot. Keep your hat pulled low." "I am not afraid of the sun, Mr. Thorne," she replied. He paused. He looked at her over his shoulder, those slate eyes seeing a little too much. "Out here, ma'am, the sun is the least of your worries." He helped her up onto the hard wooden bench of the wagon. The scent of him washed over her. Leather, pine, horse sweat, clean earth. It was a grounding smell, a safe smell. For a brief, agonizing second, Clara wanted to weep. She wanted to collapse against his broad chest and confess everything. The stolen money, the forged papers, the cold-blooded man tracking her across 3 states. But she couldn't. Truth was a luxury she could no longer afford. To speak the truth was to invite death to Silver Creek Ranch. Elias clicked his tongue. The horses lurched forward. The wagon began its slow, grinding journey into the vast expanse of the valley. The wagon wheels chewed through the rocky soil. Every jolt sent a sharp ache up Clara's spine. The heat was a living thing pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating her. But she didn't complain. She sat perfectly still. She watched his hands on the reins. They were scarred, the knuckles thick. These were hands that worked the earth until it bled, hands that could protect. She swallowed hard. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She touched the small, hard lump sewn into the lining of her corset. The key, the only thing keeping her alive. The very thing that would destroy this man beside her if he ever found out. "Water," he said, suddenly breaking the hypnotic rhythm of the horse's hooves. He offered her a dented tin canteen. Their fingers brushed as she took it. His skin was rough hot. A spark of static leaped between them, causing them both to flinch. She drank. The water was lukewarm and tasted of tin, but it was the best thing she had ever swallowed. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias simply nodded, turning his gaze back to the endless horizon. Mountains loomed in the distance, jagged teeth tearing into the pale blue sky. "We crossed the ridge before sundown," he said softly. "Then you're home." Home. The word echoed in her mind. A cruel, beautiful joke. She had no home. She only had a hiding place. Silence stretched between them, thick, heavy, alive. Elias kept his eyes on the trail. He noticed the way she sat, rigid, alert, her eyes darting to every rustling bush, every shadow cast by the towering pines. She wasn't looking at the scenery. She was looking for an ambush. He tightened his grip on the leather reins. He had bargained for a bride, a companion to share the crushing weight of the ranch. But as the wind howled through the canyon, carrying the scent of dry brush and distant rain, Elias knew one thing for certain. He hadn't brought home a wife. He had brought home a secret, and secrets in the West always ended in blood. The sun bled out across the jagged horizon. It left behind a bruised sky of violent crimson and deep hollow purple. The temperature dropped the moment the light vanished. It wasn't a slow chill. It was a sudden physical strike against Clara's skin. She pulled her thin wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. She shivered. The wagon creaked. The horse's hooves beat a slow, exhausted rhythm against the hardening earth. They crested the final ridge. "There," Elias said. His voice was a low gravel path in the quiet dusk. Clara followed his gloved hand. Down in the valley, nestled against a formidable wall of dark towering pines, sat Silver Creek Ranch. It was not the grand estate she had pictured in her desperate daydreams. It was a collection of stubborn, weathered buildings clinging desperately to the earth. A main cabin built of thick raw logs, a sagging barn, a labyrinth of wooden corrals that looked like bleached ribs in the fading light. It was isolated. It was desolate. It was completely cut off from the rest of the civilized world. It was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen, because it was hidden. Elias guided the horses down the steep incline. The rhythmic clinking of leather harnesses and iron bits echoed in the vast emptiness. He pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin. He didn't offer her a hand down. He didn't offer a warm smile. He simply unhitched the horses and hauled her heavy trunk from the back of the wagon. Clara climbed down on her own. Her legs were numb. Her boots hit the dirt with a soft thud. A cloud of dry dust puffed up, coating the hem of her skirt. She stood in front of the heavy wooden door. She took a deep breath. The air tasted of pine needles and impending frost. Elias pushed the door open. He carried her trunk inside and dropped it at the foot of an iron frame bed. The thud violently shook the floorboards. Dust danced in the pale moonlight, spilling through the single dirty window. Clara stepped over the threshold. The cabin smelled of old wood smoke, stale, bitter coffee, worn leather, and a profound, suffocating loneliness. "It ain't much," Elias said. He didn't look at her. He was busy striking a match against the iron stove. The match flared. A sharp hiss. The smell of sulfur temporarily masked the scent of the pine. He lit a kerosene lantern. Warm yellow light pushed back the heavy shadows. It revealed a room stripped of comfort, a rough-hewn table, 2 mismatched chairs, a cast-iron stove dominating the center. "It's a roof," Clara replied quietly. Her voice sounded fragile in the cavernous silence. "And it has 4 walls. That is enough." Elias turned. The lantern light cast harsh, dramatic shadows across the sharp angles of his weathered face. He studied her. His slate-gray eyes traced the lines of exhaustion around her mouth, the rigid tension in her jaw. "I sleep up in the loft," he said. He pointed a calloused, thick thumb toward a crude wooden ladder bolted to the wall. "Bed is yours." Relief washed over her. A cold, trembling wave of relief. She wouldn't have to share a bed with this stranger. Not yet. Not while the secret still burned like a brand against her ribs. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "Elias," he corrected her. His tone was flat, unyielding. "We're married now, Clara. On paper, at least. Mr. Thorne makes me sound like my father. And my father is dead." Clara swallowed. The dry dust in her throat scratched. "Elias," he nodded once. A sharp, definitive movement. "There's fresh water in the pitcher, hard biscuits in the tin box by the stove. Dawn comes early here. Get some sleep." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned, grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from a peg on the wall, and climbed the ladder into the pitch-black shadows of the loft. Clara was left alone. The silence of the cabin was deafening. In Chicago, the night was always alive. The rattle of iron-wheeled carriages, the distant shouts of men in the streets, the rhythmic clattering of the elevated trains. Here, there was nothing, just the wind whining through the chinks in the logs, a high, mournful sound, like a woman weeping in the dark. If you are listening to this wind howl and you can feel the bitter cold of the frontier creeping into your own room, let me know in the comments below. Tell me you are surviving the night with her. Clara moved to her trunk. Her hands shook as she unlatched the heavy brass locks. Click, click. The sound was too loud. It echoed off the walls. She glanced up at the loft. No movement, no sound from the man above. She opened the heavy lid. Inside lay the remnants of a carefully constructed lie. Modest, cheap cotton dresses, thick wool stockings, a small Bible with a name that wasn't hers written on the inside cover in faded ink, and hidden beneath the false bottom, the real Clara. She ran her fingers over the hidden compartment. Inside was a velvet pouch, heavy, clinking with stolen gold coins, and a thick bundle of ledger papers wrapped in silk ribbon. Papers that condemned a very powerful, very dangerous man to the gallows. The man who was hunting her, Silas Vance. Just thinking his name made the air in the room freeze. Clara closed her eyes. The memory hit her like a physical blow, a sudden violent flashback, the smell of rain on wet cobblestones, the deafening rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in a dark velvet-lined study. Silas standing by the roaring fire. His smile was a razor blade, his eyes dead black and empty. "You can run, little bird," he had whispered, his breath hot and smelling of brandy against her neck. "But my reach is long, and my patience is short." Clara gasped. Her eyes snapped open. She was back in the cabin. The kerosene lantern sputtered, casting wild dancing shadows against the raw timber logs. She was safe. For now. She quickly unlaced her stiff, dusty boots. She peeled off the heavy traveling dress. She stood in her thin cotton chemise, violently shivering in the drafty room. Her fingers found the hidden seam inside her corset. She felt the hard outline of a small iron key. The key to the lockbox back in Denver. The lockbox that held the rest of the damning evidence. She had to keep it safe. She had to keep Elias safe from it. She climbed into the iron frame bed. The mattress was stuffed with dry straw. It crunched loudly beneath her weight. The wool blanket was heavy and scratched her bare skin. She stared up at the wooden ceiling boards. Directly above her, she heard the slow creak of wood. Elias turning over in his sleep. He was a good man. She could feel it in the quiet, heavy strength of his presence. He had married a stranger to save his failing ranch. He didn't deserve the violent storm she had dragged to his quiet doorstep. Tears pricked her eyes, hot, angry, and shameful. She wiped them away fiercely with the back of her hand. Crying was a luxury. Crying was a weakness. And weakness meant death. She forced her breathing to slow, deep, rhythmic, matching the slow, steady whine of the prairie wind. Sleep, she commanded herself. Tomorrow, the real lie begins. Dawn broke not with a gentle golden glow, but with a harsh, unyielding gray light that sliced through the dusty window panes. A rooster crowed outside, a sharp, jagged sound that violently ripped Clara from a restless, nightmare-plagued sleep. Her body ached. Every single muscle was stiff from the brutal stagecoach ride and the hard straw mattress. The air in the cabin was freezing. She could see her breath blooming in small white clouds before her face. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the floorboards above. Elias was already awake, moving with purpose. She scrambled out of the warm cocoon of the blankets. The wooden floor was like block ice against her bare feet. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling clumsily with the tiny buttons of her modest gray work dress. She walked into the main room. Elias was at the iron stove. He was pushing thick sap-covered blocks of pine into the firebox. The fire roared to life, casting a warm, flickering orange glow over his broad, muscular back. He didn't turn around to greet her. "Coffee's boiling," he said. His voice was thick with sleep. Clara moved to the wooden counter. She found a dented tin cup and poured the thick black liquid from the heavy pot. It smelled like burnt earth and ash. She took a hesitant sip. It was bitter enough to strip the paint off a wall, but it was scorching hot. It sent a jolt of fire and life down her cold throat. "Thank you," she said. Elias closed the iron stove door with a loud clang. He turned and leaned back against the counter. He held his own steaming cup in both hands. He looked at her, really looked at her. His slate eyes took in her neat, perfectly braided hair, her perfectly clean pressed dress, her pale, soft, unblemished hands clinging to the warm tin cup. He took a slow sip of his coffee. His eyes never left hers. "I'll be out tending the lower herd today," he said, slowly measuring his words. "There's a patch of barbed wire fence down by the western ridge. Needs mending." He paused. "The chickens need feeding. The water trough needs breaking, it froze over solid in the night. And the garden out back is choked with dead weeds. The soil is hard as iron." He was testing her. She knew it instantly. He wanted to see if the delicate, pampered city girl would crack. He wanted to see if she would cry, if she would complain about the dirt, the bitter cold, the back-breaking labor of a ranch wife. Clara met his hard gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. "I will handle it," she said. Her voice was steady, smooth as glass. Elias raised an eyebrow. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of surprise crossed his weathered face. "The heavy axe is by the back door," he said, "for the ice." He set his empty tin cup down on the table. He picked up his worn, sweat-stained leather hat and jammed it low onto his head. "Keep a rifle handy," he added casually, his large hand resting on the heavy wooden latch of the front door. Clara froze. The warmth of the coffee vanished. "A rifle!" "Coyotes," Elias replied flatly. "Mountain lions, and sometimes desperate men who don't belong on this land." He looked at her for a long, heavy moment. It was an intense, probing stare. It felt as if he could see right through the gray cotton of her dress, right through the false name on the marriage certificate, right into the black, terrified heart beating wildly in her chest. "If you see anything moving out there that ain't cattle or horse," he said softly, dangerously, "you shoot first. You understand?" Clara swallowed hard. The bitter coffee churned violently in her empty stomach. "I understand," she whispered. Elias nodded once. He pushed open the heavy door. The freezing morning air rushed in, smelling of pine sap and sharp frost. He stepped out into the gray, desolate dawn, pulling the door tightly closed behind him. Clara was alone again. She set her tin cup down. Her hands were shaking violently now, not from the freezing air. She walked slowly to the back door. There, leaning against the rough, splintered log wall, was an old axe. Its iron blade was chipped, but lethally sharp. Next to it stood a Winchester repeating rifle, cold steel and polished walnut wood. She reached out. Her delicate fingers brushed the freezing cold barrel of the rifle. She had lied to Elias. Just by standing here, she was a lie. She knew how to use a rifle. Silas Vance had taught her how to shoot himself. Back when she thought he was a gentleman. Back before she realized he was a monster. Before she stole his ledger and ruined his life. She curled her fingers around the heavy wooden handle of the axe. She lifted it. It was incredibly heavy, throwing her slightly off balance. This ranch was a brutal, unforgiving place. The physical work would break her back. The bitter cold would crack her skin and make her joints ache. The vast, empty isolation would constantly test her fragile sanity. But as she pushed open the back door and stepped out into the freezing, desolate, breathtaking beauty of the valley, Clara felt a strange, fierce spark of pure determination ignite in her chest. She would chop the thick ice. She would pull the deep-rooted weeds. She would bleed into this unforgiving earth if she had to. She would become the perfect, devoted, hard-working wife of Elias Thorne. Because if she didn't, the shadow of her past wouldn't just take her life, it would take his too. The first week broke her. It was a systematic, brutal dismantling of the woman she used to be. The soft, terrified city girl was stripped away piece by piece, left in the unforgiving dirt of the Nevada territory. The axe handle was rough, unsanded hickory wood. It gnawed at the delicate skin of her palms until heavy water-filled blisters rose bright and angry. Then the blisters tore open. They wept clear fluid, then blood soaking into the ragged leather work gloves she found abandoned in a dusty corner of the barn. She didn't stop. Smack, crack, splinter. The ice on the water trough was thick as a blacksmith's anvil. Every swing of the heavy iron axe sent a violent, jarring shockwave up her arms, rattling her teeth, pulling at muscles in her back she didn't know existed. Her breath plumed in the freezing morning air. White clouds of pure, silent exhaustion. By noon, the sun was a punishing, indifferent eye burning in the pale blue sky. It baked the dust onto her sweating skin. By dusk, the bitter cold returned, sinking its jagged, icy teeth into her swollen joints. She pulled weeds from the hardened earth behind the cabin. Her fingernails cracked, dirt packed beneath them, turning them permanently black. Her back screamed in agonizing protest, with every bend, every pull, every heavy basket of dead roots she hauled to the burn pile. This was the rhythm of Silver Creek Ranch. Pain, dirt, survival, repeat. Elias watched her. He never said a word, but she felt his slate-gray eyes on her. From the wooden fence of the corral, from the deep shadow of the barn door, from the saddle of his massive roan gelding, as he rode out to check the fence lines. He had expected her to break. He had expected to come home and find her heavy trunk packed. He had expected tears, tantrums, and demands to be taken back to the train station. He knew the brutal reality of this land. It chewed up the weak and spit out their bones. Instead, he watched her bleed into his land. He watched her drag heavy buckets of water until her shoulders slumped. He watched her chop wood until she could barely lift her arms. Yet she still dragged the heavy logs inside to keep the cabin warm for his return. One evening, he came into the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. The smell of horse sweat leather and cold pine followed him through the door. Clara was standing at the iron stove. She was stirring a pot of thin beef stew. Her movements were stiff. Her hands were clumsily wrapped in strips of clean white linen, ripped from the hem of one of her petticoats. Elias walked to the tin wash basin. He splashed freezing water over his face and hands. The silence between them was different now. It had shifted. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of strangers anymore. It was the quiet, cautious silence of two wild animals sharing the same small, dangerous cage. He sat at the rough-hewn table. The wood groaned under his weight. Clara turned. She placed a steaming tin bowl in front of him. The scent of salt roasted meat and desperately needed warmth filled the small room. "Your hands," he said. His voice was a low rumble. It startled her. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary. Clara quickly hid her bandaged hands in the folds of her flour sack apron. She looked down at the floorboards. "They are fine. They are bleeding through the cloth. It's just blisters, Elias. I am fine." He didn't touch his spoon. He reached into the deep pocket of his heavy canvas coat. He pulled out a small round tin. He set it on the table between them. It landed with a soft metallic clink. "Pine pitch and beeswax," he said, his slate eyes fixed on her face. "Made it myself. It burns like hellfire when you first put it on, but it draws out the infection, toughens the skin. Put it on before you sleep." Clara stared at the little tin. It was battered, worn smooth from years of riding in his pocket. It was the most intimate, thoughtful thing anyone had ever given her. She felt a dangerous tightness in her throat, a sudden overwhelming urge to cry, not from the pain in her hands, but from the unexpected weight of his kindness. She reached out slowly, her bandaged fingers trembling as she picked up the tin. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias nodded once. He picked up his spoon and began to eat. He didn't say another word for the rest of the night, but as Clara sat across from him, the bitter cold of the cabin didn't feel quite so sharp. Days bled into weeks. The frontier stripped away the concept of time. There were no grandfather clocks here, no church bells ringing the hour, only the rising sun, the setting moon, the endless hunger of the cattle. Clara found a strange hypnotic peace in the endless cycle of labor. Wake before dawn in the freezing dark, chop the wood, break the ice, boil the bitter coffee, feed the restless chickens, mend the torn shirts by the dim yellow light of the kerosene lantern. It was a punishing physical meditation. When her body ached so deeply, she thought her bones might simply snap. Her mind was finally quiet. She was too exhausted to remember the velvet-lined study in Chicago, too exhausted to remember the smell of expensive brandy, too exhausted to see the cold, dead black eyes of Silas Vance in her nightmares. The ranch was saving her. The land was harsh, but it was honest. If you worked, you ate. If you rested too long, you froze. There were no hidden motives here, no deceitful smiles, no forged ledgers. She began to notice the terrifying beauty of her prison. She noticed how the morning frost coated the tall prairie grass, turning the entire valley into a glittering sea of shattered glass. She noticed the deep, rich smell of the earth after a sudden violent afternoon thunderstorm. She noticed the way Elias's broad shoulders relaxed slightly when he stood on the porch and looked out over his herd. They began to work side by side. When a late-season blizzard threatened to bury the lower pasture, Clara didn't stay in the cabin. She pulled on Elias's spare canvas coat. It swallowed her whole, smelling fiercely of his tobacco and sweat. She rode out with him into the blinding white fury. The wind screamed. The snow slashed at her face like tiny razor blades. For 6 agonizing hours they pushed the frightened, bellowing cattle toward the shelter of the canyon walls. Elias rode point, a dark, commanding shadow in the whiteout. Clara rode the flank, shouting, until her throat was raw, swinging a coiled rope to keep the strays in line. When they finally secured the herd and rode back to the cabin, they were half frozen. Their eyelashes were caked in thick ice. They stumbled through the heavy door and collapsed by the iron stove. Clara's hands were shaking so violently she couldn't light the match. Elias took it from her. His own hands were trembling. He struck the match, lit the kindling, and then without a word, he took her frozen hands in his. His calluses scraped against her toughened skin. He rubbed her hands briskly, forcing the blood back into her numb fingers. The heat radiating from his massive frame washed over her. She looked up. He was staring intensely at her. Not with the suspicious, calculating gaze of the man who had picked her up at the stagecoach station, but with a deep, profound respect. "You did good today, Clara," he said softly. The wind howling outside seemed to fade away beneath the heavy timbre of his voice. "You saved half the herd." "We saved them." She corrected gently, her breath catching in her chest. For a fleeting second, his gaze dropped to her lips. The air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly thick. The space between them vanished. The lie she carried felt heavier than it ever had. She wanted to tell him. God, she wanted to tell him everything. To lay the gold and the ledger at his boots and beg for his protection. But he let go of her hands. He stepped back. The moment shattered. "Get close to the fire," he muttered, turning away to hang up his snow-caked coat. "Don't want you catching pneumonia. Can't afford to lose my best ranch hand." It was a joke, a rough frontier joke, but it made Clara smile. A real, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. But the past is a shadow, and shadows only grow longer as the sun sets. The illusion of safety began to crack a week later. It started with a subtle, creeping dread. The physical exhaustion was no longer enough to keep the ghosts at bay. The nightmares returned. She was running through endless dark cobblestone streets, footsteps echoing behind her, a slow, methodical tapping of a silver-tipped cane. Silas. He was whistling a slow, off-key tune. She tried to scream, but her lungs were full of dust. She would wake up violently, gasping for air, in the pitch-black cabin, her hand instinctively flying to the hidden seam in her corset to feel the hard lump of the iron key. She became jumpy, paranoiac. If the wind slammed the barn door too hard, she dropped her broom and ran for the Winchester rifle. If a coyote howled too close to the tree line, she spent the next hour staring out the dirty window into the dark, her heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. Elias noticed. He saw the dark circles blooming beneath her striking green eyes. He saw the way she constantly checked the horizon. "You expecting someone?" he asked one morning over coffee. His voice was casual, but his slate eyes were sharp, probing. "No." Clara lied smoothly, taking a sip from her tin cup to hide the sudden tremor in her lips. "Just not used to the vastness yet. Sometimes I think the mountains are closing in on me." Elias didn't push it, but he didn't believe her either. 2 days later, the sky turned a bruised, heavy shade of violet. The air pressure dropped thick and suffocating. Another storm was brewing over the jagged peaks. Elias was miles away, riding the northern boundary to check the wire fencing before the weather broke. Clara was alone. She was outside hanging wet laundry on the thick rope line stretched between the cabin and the corner of the barn. The wind was picking up, snapping the heavy, freezing canvas sheets like distant gunfire. She paused to pull her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind bit fiercely at the exposed skin of her neck. She turned back toward the cabin to grab the empty laundry basket, and then she stopped. The breath violently left her lungs. Her blood turned to ice water. She looked up, past the weathered wooden corral, past the winding silver ribbon of the creek, up onto the high, jagged ridge that overlooked the entire valley. A silhouette, stark black against the bruised violet sky. It was a man on horseback. He was too far away to see his face, but she didn't need to see his face. She knew the unnatural rigid posture. She knew the long, heavy drape of the tailored city overcoat flapping violently in the wind. He wasn't moving. He wasn't driving cattle. He wasn't a neighboring rancher looking for a stray calf. He was just sitting there, perfectly still, watching the cabin, watching her. Clara's hands began to shake so violently she dropped the woven laundry basket. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. He found me. The thought was a deafening scream in her mind. Silas found me. The distance between Chicago and the Nevada territory suddenly vanished. The vast protective expanse of the frontier evaporated into thin air. Her sanctuary was broken. The walls had fallen. She stood absolutely paralyzed in the dirt, her eyes locked on the dark rider on the ridge. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the unmistakable, chilling promise of violence. Before the storm hits and the truth comes out, pause right here with Clara. If your heart is beating as fast as hers right now, drop a black heart in the comments below. Tell me what you think Elias will do when he finds out who she really is. The rider sat motionless for one long, agonizing minute. Then he smoothly turned his horse around. He didn't ride down into the valley. He simply crested the ridge and disappeared behind the jagged rocks, swallowed by the impending storm. He was gone. But Clara knew the terrifying truth of men like Silas Vance. He wasn't leaving. He was just waiting for the dark. She turned and ran for the cabin. She didn't bother with the door latch. She kicked it open, rushed inside, and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind her, throwing the thick iron deadbolt into place. She ran to the back door, locked it, ran to the single window, and pulled the heavy woolen curtain shut, plunging the cabin into heavy shadows. She stumbled to the corner of the room, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Her toughened, calloused hands reached out and grabbed the cold steel barrel of the Winchester rifle. The rhythm of the ranch was over. The rhythm of war was about to begin. The storm broke with a violent, deafening crack. Thunder shook the heavy log walls of the cabin. It vibrated up through the floorboards, settling deep in Clara's bones. The rain did not fall. It attacked. It lashed against the single darkened window like handfuls of sharp gravel. The wind shrieked down the stone chimney, blowing cold, bitter ash from the iron stove out across the rough wooden floor. Clara sat in the darkest corner of the room. Her knees were pulled tightly to her chest. Her calloused, blistered hands gripped the cold, polished walnut stock of the Winchester rifle. The heavy iron barrel rested on her knee, pointed directly at the heavy oak door. She did not light the kerosene lantern. Light was a target. Light was death. She just sat in the suffocating blackness, listening to the wrath of the Nevada sky. Every shadow in the room looked like a man in a tailored overcoat. Every creak of the settling timber sounded like a heavy boot on the front porch. She was waiting for the devil, and then she heard it. Not a boot, not a knock, but the frantic, terrified whinny of a horse cutting through the roar of the wind. Clara stood up. Her heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. She raised the rifle. Her finger found the cold iron trigger. She leveled the barrel at the center of the wooden door. Heavy footsteps splashed through the mud outside. Fast, urgent. A hand grabbed the iron latch. It rattled violently. "Clara!" The voice was a deep, familiar rumble, muffled by the thick wood and the roaring storm. "Elias!" Clara gasped. The breath tore out of her throat. She dropped the barrel of the rifle, rushed across the dark room, and threw back the heavy iron deadbolt. Elias shoved the door open. He crashed into the room, bringing the freezing, violent storm in with him. He slammed the door shut behind him, with a heavy shoulder throwing the bolt back into place. He was soaked to the bone. His canvas coat was heavy and black with rain. Water poured from the wide brim of his hat, pooling on the floorboards. He stood there, chest-heaving, gasping for air. He looked at the unlit cabin. He looked at the heavy woolen curtains pulled tightly over the glass. And then his slate-gray eyes fell to her hands, to the Winchester rifle gripped tightly in her white knuckles. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavier than the storm outside. Elias slowly took off his dripping hat. He tossed it onto the rough-hewn table. He didn't move toward her. He didn't ask if she was all right. The raw, primal instinct of the frontier had already given him the answer. Something was hunting them. "Who is out there?" Elias asked. His voice was dangerously quiet, slower than usual, a predator assessing a trap. Clara took a step back. The darkness of the cabin felt entirely inadequate to hide her shame. "Clara," Elias said. He stepped forward. The floorboards groaned beneath his heavy, soaked boots. "I saw tracks by the ridge, 5 horses, shod with city iron, not ranch steel. They were sitting on the high point watching my valley." He stopped 3 feet from her. He towered over her in the gloom. The smell of wet wool horse sweat and cold rain rolled off him. "I asked you who is out there." Her throat was completely dry. The lie she had carefully tended for weeks dried up and blew away like dead leaves. She reached her free hand up to the collar of her modest gray dress. Her fingers trembled violently. She reached inside, finding the hidden seam of her corset. She ripped the fabric. The sound of tearing cotton was startlingly loud in the quiet tension of the room. She pulled out the small, heavy iron key. She walked past Elias. She didn't look at his face. She couldn't bear to see the betrayal taking root in his eyes. She went to her trunk at the foot of the bed. She knelt on the floorboards. She unlocked the brass clasps. She threw open the lid. She bypassed the cheap cotton dresses and the fake Bible. She dug her fingers into the false bottom of the heavy wood. With a sharp pull, the wood splintered. She lifted out the heavy velvet pouch and the thick bundle of ledger papers tied with silk ribbon. She stood up. She walked back to the center of the room. She placed the items on the rough wooden table right next to his dripping hat. She untied the velvet pouch. Gold coins spilled out. Heavy gleaming double eagles. Hundreds of them. They clattered against the wood, a sickeningly rich sound in the impoverished cabin. Elias stared at the gold. His face was a mask of carved stone. Unreadable. Terrifying. "My name is not Clara Miller," she whispered. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to look up, to finally meet his eyes. "My name is Clara Vance, and the man waiting out in the storm is my husband's brother, Silas." Elias didn't touch the gold. He didn't touch the papers. He just stared at her. "You're married," he stated flatly. The words hung in the freezing air. "I was," Clara choked out. Tears finally broke free, hot and angry, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "My husband was a monster, Elias, a cruel, vicious man who ran the gambling syndicates in Chicago. When he died, Silas took over, and Silas is worse." She pointed a trembling finger at the thick ledger. "That book proves Silas bribed federal judges. It proves he ordered the murder of 3 Union leaders. I stole it. I took the gold from his private safe so I could run. I bought the forged papers. I answered your advertisement because I needed a place so isolated, so forgotten by God, that Silas would never look for me." Elias looked slowly around the cabin. He looked at the leaking roof, the drafty walls, the meager fire dying in the stove, the life he had bled for day in and day out. "You used me," he said. The quiet devastation in his voice was a physical blow to her chest. "I wanted to survive," Clara cried out, stepping toward him. "I didn't want to hurt you, Elias, but if he found me in the city, he would have dragged me back and tortured me until I gave up that ledger. I had no choice." "You brought the devil to my door," Elias growled. His voice finally broke, vibrating with a sudden towering rage. "You brought a war to my land, to my home." "I know," Clara sobbed, dropping her head. "I know, and I am so sorry." She stepped back. She picked up the Winchester rifle from where she had leaned it against a chair. She held it out to him. "Take the gold, Elias," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Take the gold and ride out the back way. The storm will cover your tracks. He doesn't want you. He wants me and the ledger. You can save the ranch. You can save yourself. Just leave me here." Elias looked at the rifle in her outstretched hands. He looked at her tear-streaked face, her exhausted, hollow eyes. He looked at her hands, the hands that were soft and pampered when she arrived, the hands that were now blistered, torn, and scarred from breaking ice and pulling weeds to save his cattle. The silence stretched, pulled tight to the point of snapping. Then, over the roaring wind, a new sound emerged. A dog barking in the distance, cut brutally short by the sharp, echoing crack of a gunshot. Clara flinched, the color completely drained from her face. Elias didn't take the rifle from her hands. Instead, he reached down to his gun belt. He drew his heavy Colt revolver. The cylinder spun with a deadly metallic click. "Put the gold away," Elias ordered. His voice was no longer angry. It was terrifyingly calm, cold as the ice in the water trough. "Elias, please!" "I said put it away," he snapped. He strode past her, moving to the darkened window. He pulled the heavy woolen curtain back just a fraction of an inch, peering out into the torrential rain. "This is my ranch. You are my wife under the law of this territory, and no city bastard in a fancy coat is stepping foot on my porch." Clara's breath hitched. A wild, desperate surge of hope and terror collided in her chest. She grabbed the velvet pouch, shoved the gold and the ledger back inside, and kicked it under the iron bed. "How many?" she asked, racking the lever of the Winchester. The heavy brass cartridge slid into the chamber with a satisfying, rhythmic clack-clack. Elias didn't turn around. "I see 4 shadows in the tree line, spreading out. They are trying to surround the cabin." "Silas makes 5, Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Then we have a long night ahead," Elias replied. "Before the first bullet shatters the glass, tell me you are standing with Clara and Elias. Hit the like button to fortify the cabin, and let me know in the comments if you think they can survive the night." The storm raged. The rain hammered the roof. And then a voice cut through the tempest, smooth, cultured, dripping with a terrifying, unnatural calm. "Clara, my dear." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, amplified by the canyon walls. Clara froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Her finger tightened on the trigger. "It's a very cold night, Clara," Silas Vance called out from the darkness. "And you have something that belongs to our family. Open the door. Bring me the book. Bring me the money, and I will leave this poor dirt farmer in peace." Elias looked at Clara. He motioned with his chin toward the heavy log wall beside the window. "Move," his eyes commanded. Clara pressed her back against the rough, splintered wood. She raised the rifle, aiming it at the door. "I know you are in there, little bird," Silas called again. His voice was closer now. He was walking across the muddy yard. "You always were too smart for your own good, but you have nowhere left to fly. The stagecoach doesn't run until Tuesday. The telegraph lines are down. You are completely alone." "She ain't alone!" Elias's voice boomed out. It was a roar of pure, untamed frontier defiance. It shook the walls. A beat of silence passed. Just the rain. Then Silas laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Ah, the noble rancher," Silas sneered. "I admire your courage, friend, but you are dying for a whore who lied to you from the moment she stepped off the train." "That may be," Elias shouted back, "but she works harder than any man I've ever met, and she's a damn sight better shot than you." The thunder crashed, and the night exploded into violence. The front window shattered inward. A spray of broken glass and splintered wood rained across the cabin floor as a heavy bullet tore through the gloom, embedding itself deep into the stone of the chimney. Elias didn't flinch. He thrust his Colt through the broken window frame and fired twice into the dark. Two massive flashes of orange light illuminated the cabin. The deafening roar of the .45 caliber gun was absolute. A man screamed outside. A heavy thud in the mud followed. "One down!" Elias grunted, pulling back behind the thick logs as 3 more shots tore through the front door, splintering the heavy oak like kindling. Clara didn't hesitate. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, mechanical instinct for survival. Silas had taught her to shoot. She would show him just how well she learned. She dropped to one knee. She aimed through a gaping hole in the splintered front door. She saw a muzzle flash in the darkness near the barn. She pulled the trigger. The Winchester kicked violently against her shoulder, a bruising, punishing impact. She racked the lever, fired again, clack, clack, bang, clack, clack, bang. The cabin filled with the thick, choking, sulfuric stench of gun smoke. It burned her eyes. It coated the back of her throat with the taste of copper and ash. Bullets hammered the cabin. They tore through the thin tin roof. They shattered the water pitcher on the table, sending freezing water cascading across the floorboards. "Back door!" Elias roared over the deafening noise. Clara spun around. The heavy iron latch of the rear door was violently rattling. Someone was trying to kick it in. She scrambled across the wet floorboards, her knees scraping painfully against the rough wood. She threw herself against the heavy log wall beside the back door. The wood splintered violently as a heavy boot slammed against it from the outside. The iron deadbolt groaned. Clara pressed the barrel of the Winchester against the thickest part of the door, right where a man's chest would be. She pulled the trigger. The bullet tore clean through the oak. A sudden sharp gasp from the other side. The sound of a body collapsing heavily against the wood, then sliding slowly down into the mud. Silence at the back door. She racked the lever. The smoking brass casing spun out, hitting the floor with a tiny metallic tink. "Two," Clara whispered. Her breathing was ragged, shallow. "Reload!" Elias shouted. He ducked as a volley of bullets tore through the front wall, raining deadly wood splinters down on his broad shoulders. Clara pulled a handful of heavy brass cartridges from her apron pocket. Her hands were shaking violently now. The adrenaline was peaking. She forced the rounds into the side-loading gate of the rifle. "They're moving!" Elias yelled, peering through the gun smoke filling the room. "They're trying to set the barn on fire." Clara's heart stopped. The horses, the winter feed. If the barn burned, the ranch was dead. Even if they survived the night, they would starve in the winter. "Cover me!" Elias roared. Before Clara could stop him, Elias unbolted the front door. He kicked it open. He stepped out onto the porch directly into the blinding rain and the teeth of the storm. "Elias, no!" Clara screamed. "Clara!" He didn't listen. He leveled his Colt and fired 3 rapid shots toward the men huddled by the barn with torches. The men scattered like rats. One dropped his torch into the mud, the flame hissing and dying instantly in the torrential downpour. But Elias had exposed himself. From the shadow of the corral, a 4th man stepped out. He raised a shotgun. Clara saw it all happening in horrific slow motion. She didn't think. She moved. She threw herself into the open doorway. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder. She didn't have time to aim down the iron sights. She just pointed and pulled the trigger. The rifle roared. The man with the shotgun jerked violently backward. His weapon fired into the sky, a useless blast of buckshot tearing into the rain clouds. He fell into the muddy water, trough dead, before he hit the ground. Clara dropped the rifle. She ran out onto the porch, grabbing Elias by his heavy canvas coat. "Get inside! Get inside!" She screamed frantically, hauling him backward into the cabin. They collapsed together onto the wet, splinter-covered floor. Elias kicked the ruined door shut with his boot. They lay there in the dark, gasping for air. The smell of blood, wet wool, and burnt gunpowder was suffocating. Elias rolled over. He grabbed her shoulders. His large, rough hands squeezed tightly. "Are you hit?" He demanded, his voice trembling with a terrifying vulnerability she had never heard before. "Clara, are you hit?" "No," she sobbed, checking her own body frantically. "No, I'm okay. Are you?" He nodded, leaning his forehead against hers in the darkness. They were both shaking. The silence returned. It was heavy, oppressive. The rain continued to beat down on the roof, but the gunfire had stopped. 3 men dead. 1 wounded and fled. But not Silas. Clara knew it. The cold dread in her stomach had not vanished. It had hardened into a block of solid ice. "He's still out there," Clara whispered, her breath hot against Elias's face. Elias tightened his grip on his Colt. He slowly pushed himself up off the floor. "Stay here," he ordered. He moved toward the ruined door. The wood was hanging off its iron hinges. "Elias Thorne." The voice was directly outside, on the porch. Silas Vance had walked right up to the cabin while they were pulling themselves off the floor. "You killed my men, dirt farmer," Silas said. His cultured voice was finally fractured, strained with fury and exertion. "But you won't kill me. I have a stick of dynamite. I will strike the match and throw it through this shattered window. We can all burn together." Clara's blood ran cold. "Send the girl out," Silas hissed. "Send her out with the book, and you get to keep your miserable life." Elias stood perfectly still in the shadows by the door. He looked back at Clara. She was kneeling on the wet floorboards, her hands empty, her eyes wide, with absolute paralyzing terror. He looked at the woman who had lied to him, the woman who had brought death to his doorstep, the woman who had just stepped in front of a shotgun blast to save his life. Elias turned back to the door. "If you want her," Elias said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble of pure frontier vengeance, "you're going to have to walk through me." He stepped out of the shadows. He raised his Colt, but Silas was faster. A single gunshot rang out, not a heavy revolver, a small suppressed Derringer, a gambler's gun. Elias staggered backward. He clutched his left shoulder. He dropped to one knee, a sharp grunt of pain escaping his lips. "Elias!" Clara screamed. She scrambled across the floor. She grabbed the discarded Winchester. Silas Vance stepped into the doorway. He looked exactly as she remembered in her nightmares. Tall, impeccably dressed, even soaked in mud. His face was a pale, aristocratic mask of cruelty. His dead black eyes fixed on her. He held a lit match in one hand, the sparking fuse of a dynamite stick in the other. "Hello, little bird." Silas smiled, a razor blade in the dark. Clara didn't run. She didn't cower. The terrified city girl from Chicago was dead. She had died swinging an axe against the ice. She had died pulling weeds from the hardened earth. The woman holding the rifle was forged in the Nevada dirt. Clara leveled the Winchester directly at Silas's chest. "My name is Clara Thorne," she said. Her voice was steady, smooth as glass. She pulled the trigger. The heavy bullet caught Silas perfectly in the center of his chest. The impact threw him violently backward off the porch. The dynamite slipped from his dead fingers. It rolled into the deep, wet mud of the yard. The fuse hissed for one terrifying second, and then the torrential rain drowned it out. Silence fell over Silver Creek Ranch. Absolute ringing silence, broken only by the steady rhythmic drumming of the rain. Clara dropped the rifle. It hit the floorboards with a dull thud. She fell to her knees next to Elias. He was breathing heavily, his hand pressed tightly against his bleeding shoulder. "You shot him," Elias grunted, looking at her through the gloom. "I told you," Clara whispered, tears finally streaming freely down her face as she pressed her hands against his wound to stop the bleeding. "I learned fast." Elias reached up with his uninjured hand. He touched her cheek. His thumb wiped away a streak of mud and gunpowder. He didn't see a liar anymore. He saw a survivor. He saw his partner. "Yeah." Elias breathed, his eyes locked on hers. "You do." The storm blew itself out an hour before dawn. It left behind a battered, bruised world. The wind died down to a hollow, breathless whisper. The torrential rain faded into a soft, steady drip from the edge of the tin roof. Inside the cabin, the heavy, suffocating scent of sulfur and burnt gunpowder clung to the damp walls. Clara knelt on the rough floorboards beside the bed. The knees of her gray dress were soaked in cold mud and warm blood. She worked in the dim, flickering light of a single kerosene lantern. Her hands moved with a frantic, desperate precision. The Derringer bullet had passed clean through Elias's left shoulder. It was a miracle wrapped in a nightmare. No bone was shattered. The bullet hadn't lodged in the muscle. She washed the torn flesh with freezing water from the broken pitcher. She tore the last clean strips of white cotton from her petticoat. She poured Elias's stinging pine pitch and beeswax over the open wound. He didn't scream. He didn't pull away. He just sat on the edge of the straw mattress, breathing heavily, watching her. He watched the way her hands trembled slightly, yet never faltered. He watched the fierce, terrifying focus in her striking green eyes. She pulled the cotton bandage tight, wrapping it over his broad shoulder and across his chest, tying it off with a sharp tug. "There," Clara whispered. Her voice was incredibly fragile. The adrenaline was finally bleeding out of her veins, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep she felt her bones might turn to dust. She sat back on her heels. She looked down at her hands. They were stained crimson. A heavy, rough hand gently covered hers. Elias leaned forward. His slate-gray eyes were completely stripped of the cold, calculating distance he had worn since the day she stepped off the stagecoach. "You saved my ranch," he said. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble in the quiet cabin. "You saved my life." I brought the danger to your door. Clara replied, a single hot tear tracking through the dirt and gunpowder smeared across her cheek. The danger is dead, Elias stated, a simple absolute frontier fact. When the sun finally crested the jagged eastern peaks, it did not arrive with a gentle glow. It pierced the valley with brilliant blinding gold. Clara stepped out onto the ruined front porch. The morning air was shockingly pure. It tasted of wet pine, crushed sagebrush, and new beginnings. Swept entirely clean by the violence of the storm. The bodies were already gone. Before his shoulder had stiffened, Elias had hauled the men out past the tree line, far from the cabin. The frontier was an unsentimental graveyard. The coyotes would have their share, the buzzards would claim the rest, and the harsh Nevada earth would swallow their bones. There would be no marshals, no questions. The West kept its own secrets. Clara looked at the cabin. The heavy oak door was splintered into jagged teeth. The single window was a gaping, shattered hole. The thick log walls were peppered with deep white gouges from the heavy lead bullets. Silver Creek Ranch was deeply scarred, but it was standing. The floorboards creaked behind her. Elias walked out onto the porch. His left arm was bound tightly to his chest in a makeshift sling made from a flour sack. He stood beside her. He didn't look at the damage. He looked out over the vast, shimmering expanse of the valley. In his good right hand, he held a heavy velvet pouch. The gold. And tucked beneath his arm was the thick silk-tied ledger. He tossed the ledger onto a relatively intact wooden barrel near the door. It hit the wood with a heavy final thud. The telegraph lines will be up in a few days, Elias said. He squinted against the rising sun. We'll hitch the wagon right into town. We mail this book to the federal marshal in Chicago, anonymously. Let the government tear down whatever is left of his syndicate. Clara looked at the ledger, the anchor that had dragged her halfway across the continent, the ghost that had haunted her every waking moment, to just send it away, to be free of it. The thought made her incredibly lightheaded. And the gold? She asked softly, her eyes tracing the worn velvet of the heavy pouch in his massive hand. Elias weighed the pouch. The heavy clink of double eagles was a sharp, distinct sound in the quiet morning. It's blood money, Elias muttered. He looked out toward the empty corrals, at the broken wire fences and the starving cattle huddled in the distant canyon. He sighed, a long, deep release of breath. But dirt doesn't care where the water comes from, he said slowly, his voice settling into a steady, hypnotic rhythm. It just drinks. We use this to pay off the bank in full. We buy winter feed for the herd. We buy new lumber for the barn. We rebuild. He turned his head. He looked down at her. If that's what you want, Clara, the choice. For the first time in her life, she had a real absolute choice. She didn't have to stay. The men hunting her were dead. The syndicate would crumble when the ledger hit the marshal's desk. She had half a pouch of gold. She could take a train to California, to the ocean, to an easy, soft life in a civilized city. She looked at her hands, the calluses, the raw healing blisters, the dirt permanently packed beneath her cracked nails. She looked at the harsh, breathtaking, unforgiving beauty of the jagged mountains, and she looked at the massive, stoic man standing beside her, a man who had bled into this earth and who had been willing to bleed for her. I want to fix the window first, Clara said softly. A slow, genuine smile cracked the hard, weathered lines of Elias's face. It was a beautiful, entirely unexpected sight. It changed him completely, making him look years younger. Glass is expensive? He replied, his voice a low, warm hum. We can afford it. She smiled back. She reached out, her rough, blistered fingers laced gently through his heavy, calloused hand. He gripped her fingers back, tight, grounding, permanent. The lie was dead. Buried deep in the freezing mud with Silas Vance. What remained was the absolute truth, hard, calloused, and unyielding. They were no longer a desperate bride hiding in the shadows and a lonely rancher fighting a losing battle. They were partners, forged in gunpowder, washed clean by the storm, and bound by the rugged, unforgiving earth of the American West. The shadow had finally passed over Silver Creek, and their roots had found the rock. As Clara and Elias look out over their land, ready to rebuild a life built on truth instead of lies, I want to thank you for riding along on this journey. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, leave a comment below and tell me what was your favorite moment of Clara's transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next tale from the frontier.